everybody wants to make money, right? So, so the private sector is engaged, and other, popping out of the ground like daisies are fusion companies all over the place, all over the world. There's something like 30 or 40 of them just in the United States alone. There's a few in Canada, and there's a few in Europe, and in other parts of the world. And this has got this is Fusion Industry Association is an example of that. There's indication that fusion is coming, and the private sector is aware of it. Now, fusion, as I mentioned, is the process to power the sun and the stars. Fusion is a reaction. Okay, it's a nuclear form of power, and there are other types of nuclear power that we know about. So we all know about nuclear fission, okay? It powers Pickering and Darlington and Bruce and other places, other fission plants around the world. You're basically splitting a heavy element like uranium, and energy is released. Well, there's another process at the other end of the periodic table where you're joining light nuclei together. That also reduces energy. Actually, per mass, you release a lot more energy. And so what the reaction, like the sun, for example, and all the stars, are powered primarily by a reaction between hydrogen. Under enormous pressure coming from gravity and temperature, these nuclei fuse together and releases enormous amounts of energy. Now, the real problem, though, is how do we create the conditions that exist in the sun and the stars on Earth? Now, we actually did this a long time ago successfully, but this was not in the form of an energy source, it was in the form of a weapon. Okay, so first we developed the fission bomb, the atomic bomb, and after that, shortly after that, we developed the fusion bomb, which is the hydrogen bomb. So since about that time, also in parallel, there have been huge efforts to try to create control fusion for peaceful purposes. So this work was classified from World War II right through the 50s until 1958. In 1958, the Russians, the British, the Americans, and a few others realized this is really tough. Okay, there's no point classifying it. It's not going to be a weapon or anything else anytime soon. So 1958, the year before I was born, it became declassified. And since that time, there's been huge amounts of international collaboration. Now, the Russians were making advances in the 60s that were, I would say, not really fully believed by the West, but it was confirmed about 1969 that the Russians had a device called a tokamak, which was producing thermonuclear conditions, very high temperatures high enough that you can imagine fusion reactions going place. Remember that fusion is basically, all nuclear power is basically you convert mass into energy by Einstein's famous equation. So it's basically a bit of mass disappears, delta M, multiplied by the speed of sound squared. So a big number squared. So the huge amount of energy produced from a little decrease in the mass, which occurs when you have a reaction. Okay, so fusion occurs at really, really high temperatures. Now, there's a fourth state of matter that most people don't realize, and it's called a plasma. Not the plasma that's in your blood, okay? And most of the universe is plasma. 99.999% of the universe is plasma. The fact that we have material surfaces here and physical bodies is really exceptional. Okay? And so, you take a material like water, for example. At low temperature, water is solid. You have a solid. You warm it up a bit, it becomes a liquid. You warm it up a bit more, it becomes a gas, steam. But if you keep on going, you get above maybe 10,000 degrees Celsius, you get a fourth state of matter called the plasma. And here, the electrons are stripped away from the atoms, and you have free electrons and free nuclei, actually, and they're interspersed. So, in fact, they're quasi-neutral, that is, they don't have a charge. But the fact that there are free electrons means it conducts electricity. And that changes everything, okay? And I'll come back to that. Now, I'm looking at the audience, and I'm trying to guess what your backgrounds are. Are there engineers, or physicists, or members of the public? So I'm trying to pitch you somewhere in between all of you, so bear with me if I'm talking too technical. You can ask questions later, and there's any question will be accepted. All right, now, you think to yourself, how on earth do you hold something which is 100 million degrees? This is the temperature we're talking about. It's actually hotter than the center of the sun. The center of the sun is only like 20 million. So we're shooting shooting for 100 million or 150 million degrees Celsius. Well, the reality is there's no material surface, material that could hold such a thing. And the way we do it, we don't use material. We use a magnetic force field, magnets, magnetic fields. I'm not going to talk about inertial fusion. If you want later, at the end of the talk, we could talk about laser fusion. Magnetic fusion is the approach that has some potential for mankind, not as well. Okay, so you may have learned in high school or early university that charged particles spiral along magnetic field lines. And this is the basis of magnetic confinement, of holding something so hot. So you look at this figure, the part, whether it's an ion or electron, spirals along the magnetic field line, doesn't cross. So this is a way to hold it. If the wall is on the outside, and you have a magnetic field protecting it, you have a way of a magnetic ball from that. Now, you're going to ask immediately, what happens when you go out the end? And I'll come back to that in a minute. And that is why basically all these devices, they look like donuts, because you take the magnetic field and you turn it on itself. Anyways, magnetic fusion, magnetic form of confinement is the method that has been used and made success all over the world. And I list here some of the major institutions in the West. The ITER project, which is where most of the world is focused on, it's a tokamak. It's in the south of France, and there are 34 nations participating. And as mentioned, I've been there since 2007, and I left about a month ago. It's noteworthy to realize that there's only one industrialized country that's not participating in this project, and that's this country. And there are some strange historical reasons why that's the case, something that we're going to fix. The U.S. National Lab, Princeton Plasma Physics Lab, in Princeton University, attached to Princeton University, MIT Plasma Science and Fusion Center, and in the UK, a major lab in the United Kingdom Atomic Energy Authority. And the Max Planck Institute in Germany. Basically, these are the major labs in the West, and basically that's my employment history on the screen there. All right, now, fusion, how do we make fusion on Earth? First of all, to realize what the potential is. 1 gram fusion fuels is equivalent to 8 tons of oil. So think of that amplification factor and the potential for such an energy source. It's basically a reaction. Now, I mentioned about the sun using hydrogen, burning hydrogen. There are other isotopes of normal hydrogen. There's something called deuterium, which is 1 part in 6,000 in water, in normal water. Your body has huge amounts of energy stored in the form of deuterium, 1 part in 6,000 in the water in your body. And there's another isotope of hydrogen called tritium. Now, this isotope is not so common. In fact, it doesn't occur in nature, or at least in minuscule quantities. And in fact, it turns out that the main source of tritium in the world comes from Canada's CANDU reactors. It's a byproduct of the heavy water reactor. It's been a damn nuisance for decades because it's a little bit radioactive. And it's very elusive. It escapes easily. And so every few years, OPG and the other operators of CANDUs have to take the heavy water and take the tritium out. And they store it, and there's a vault in Darlington sitting with 20 or 30 kilograms of tritium. And this is most of the world's fusion fuel sitting just outside of Toronto. It's a huge hometown advantage for Canada. Okay, so I already mentioned about, Yeah, so typically the way we deal with the n-losses, the magnetic field and particles running out, is we turn it into a donut. Now, the fusion reaction is shown on the right here. Is basically a reaction between the deuterium and the tritium, producing a very energetic neutron with most of the energy. Now this just comes flying out. It's neutral, right? So it's not affected by the magnetic field. And then a helium alpha particle. Now this particle is charged and it's trapped on the magnetic field and will gyrate along the magnetic field as the plasma ions and deposit the heat that it's produced in the plasma. And that heat keeps the thing hot and keeps it going. It's a little bit like a piece of coal. Right? There's a lot of energy stored in a piece of coal, but it just sits there and won't burn. You have to apply a torch or a match, get it hot enough, and it starts to burn. You can take away the match or the torch, and it will just keep on burning. Because some of the heat's released, and that goes to keeping it hot. And that's exactly what the alpha particle does. In the end, what happens is the heat comes out to the wall, the neutron comes out, It deposits heat into the wall, you generate steam, you put it through turbines, you make electricity in the conventional way. Now we have ambitions of doing something more sophisticated in the future, but for the moment, we're going to rely on this old-fashioned way of making power. The first thing is to get the fusion process going. Now, what has kept us going since World War II, developing this energy source? So those advantages are here. Think of nuclear power, a new type of nuclear power, with all the advantages of fission, but none of the disadvantages. So there are disadvantages with fission. So basically, this is an energy source which has unlimited potential. It can be scaled indefinitely. Because the fuel is unlimited. It's everywhere in the water. In your body, everywhere. So there's no limit. And also that fuel is available to all nations. It's safe and environmentally responsible. The real problem with fusion is that it's difficult. If you make any mistake, you do anything wrong, it just goes out. I'm not exaggerating. The plasma is so tenuous that a baby's breath is enough to extinguish it. The quantity of energy stored in the material in the plasma is insignificant. So if anything happens, it just simply goes out. And this is very different than a fission reactor, where the energy stored in uranium in the core of the reactor, it's there. It's always there. And if you make a mistake, there are serious repercussions, as the world has observed over the last few decades. Unlimited dimension, of course, no greenhouse gas emission. Another important point is that initially there's no radioactivity at all. There's a bit of tritium, it's very small. Tritium is radioactive, but very, very mild. One thing that you have to be careful of, this neutron that comes out, it can activate the walls, and it can induce radioactivity. But you have to be clever. You use a material which may activate, but in a rather innocuous way. So we're talking about, you choose a material which has low activation, maybe silicon carbide, for example. It has a very short half-life. So rather than talking about 30 or 40,000 years half-life of high-level radioactive waste, we're talking about low or even very low radioactive waste, which has a half-life of 5 years or even less. So we tailor that waste, and it's a very manageable problem. And so this is another reason why fusion has been pursued all over. So now, there are many different types of fusion devices that have been thought of. There's only a small number here. There are probably 100 different variants. You know, these are just the magnetic fusion devices. And what you see on the... Okay, so this is an interesting way to plot it. What you see here along the horizontal axis is how the magnetic field is generated. So on the left-hand side, all of the magnetic field, in this case, is generated by current. Remember I told you plasmas conduct electricity because there are free electrons. So you pass current through the plasma, it generates a self-magnetic field. And the magnetic field itself you can find. So first you think this is great. You don't have to make coils to make the magnetic field, you just pass current through the plasma. But typically what that means is, like, nature doesn't want to have 100 million degrees here and room temperature over there. So the magnetic field you get almost certainly will not be ideal, and also certainly may lead to instabilities, turbulence, other things, which will defeat the purpose, will reduce effectively the thermal insulation provided by the magnetic field. So on the right-hand side, you have basically, on the other extreme, all of the magnetic field created by the coils, which would be external. For example, the Stellarex device that I pointed out earlier is a device where all the magnetic field is created by rather complicated coils on the outside. And I'll come back to how we're going to make them simpler. In between, these devices you may have heard of, like the big devices around the rubber tokamaks, either, for example, in France, is a tokamak. Here, much of the, not all, but part of the field is created by the current flowing in the plasma. Basically, to some extent with these devices, on the left-hand side, you rely on what nature gives you. Now, on the vertical axis, you have basically the duration of the plasma. So on the left-hand side, you have plasma that is created by current in the plasma, and basically very, very short pulses of plasma. 1 millisecond is there. And as you go up toward the tokamak, you have discharges that last a second or tens of seconds. And by the time you get to the Stellarator, you have a device which is basically steady state. You turn it on, you put the gas, you add power, it gets hot, it ignites, you take away the power source, and it just burns. for hours, for days, for weeks, for years. It's basically the closest thing that you ever come to is perpetual power device. And of course, if you're an electric utility company, what do you want? You're not going to want something that comes on in a few seconds. You want something that will churn out power continuously. Maybe you can dial it up, maybe you can dial it down, because you want it to be continuous, basically to supply the needs of the grid. All right, now, I'll talk a little bit about actual devices. So let's talk about ITER. So ITER stands for International Thermonuclear Experimental Reactor. The world's been focused on this since 1985. In 1985, there was a summit between Ronald Reagan and Mikhail Gorbachev, where they decided they would work together to pursue thermonuclear fusion for the global benefit of mankind. Things have changed a lot since then, from those days now. Unfortunately, they had another summit a few years later, and the ITER project was launched in 1988 at a design phase. It took us a while to get our act together, but basically we started construction or getting together in the south of France in 2006, 2007, when I left Canada, when I joined. It's a very large facility. It has, you can see, if you look carefully at the flags here, you see the People's Republic of China, the European Union representing all the nations of Europe, and also Switzerland, India, Korea, Japan, Korea, the Russian Federation, and the United States of America. There's no Canada on the scene here. Actually, the Russian partner has created us some problems about but they're still part of it. Now, this device is a tokamak, and it's massive. So if you look, look, it's hard to see, but if you look very carefully inside the yellow circle, you'll see a map. So this is a really complicated device and huge. And by far the largest scientific project in the world. The price tag is greater, well, we don't know what it actually costs, but right now we're estimating it's about more than 30 billion euros. So there's 33,500 people working on this in the south of France, and about another 3,000 or 4,000 people around the world. So it's a massive project, and it's based on the tokamak. Now, the tokamak, it's interesting history. In the 1950s, both were invented. The Russians focused on the tokamak, and Princeton, where, in fact, invented both, actually. And at the time, the leader of the lab that was classified decided that the tokamak wasn't worth pursuing because it had intrinsic problems. On the other hand, the Russians found it confined plasma and got thermonucleic conditions very well. The Stellarex was also born in Princeton around the same time, and it was a steady-state device, and it had many attractive features. Well, the problem is, it couldn't confine plasma very well. And really, the problem was, we hadn't invented a field yet called plasma physics. We weren't smart enough. We didn't have the computers to optimize the magnetic field, and to basically to be able to hold the plasma. All right, so there are two basically, of that zoo of different types of animals, there's only really two which have a scientific basis for a commercial reactor. And these two are on this region, the tokamak and the Stellarex. As I mentioned, the Russians were the proponents of the Stellarex, and Princeton the proponents, of the tokamak, and Princeton the proponent of the Stellarex. So about 1970, it was realized that the Russians were doing extraordinary things. And so very quickly, the rest of the world confirmed this and jumped on the bandwagon with the tokamak. For several decades, until really just very recently, the tokamak has been the leading port for the future development. As I mentioned earlier, the Stellarex has some serious problems, and the Stellarex solves those problems. The first of all is that the tokamak, let me explain. The tokamak, if you look at it, it looks simple. It's toroidally symmetric, and if you compare it to the Stellarex, it looks very complicated. And in fact, if you look at these coils, there is a world of difference in terms of the coils, and I'll come back to how we simplify that. The tokamak relies on the fact, well, all magnetic fusion relies on the fact that the magnetic field must have kind of a twist to it. If it doesn't, it's called rotational transfer. But if it doesn't have the twist, it won't be possible to confine the magnetic field against the particles. And this is a second-order effect, other than the simple thing I showed you at the beginning. Remember I showed you the picture with the particles gyrating along? Well, to first order, that's true. But there's a second-order effect, short circuit that. And that's related to the fact that the magnetic field, when it is not uniform, there's a second order drift of particles across the magnetic field, and they drift out and escape. So the way you solve that is to have this rotational transform in the magnetic field. In the case of the tokamak, the way we do that is we pass electrical current in the plasma, taking advantage of that. What that means, of course, is we only get magnetic field that the plasma decides to give us. But it also means the way we do that is we drive that current by sort of a transformer action, and it intrinsically means the device is pulsed. It's pulsed, and it means it can last for tens of seconds at the very most, maybe a minute. Okay? And the other aspect of it is that when you drive current in a magnetic field, it's intrinsically unstable. And under the right conditions, you make it stable. But you're always on the hairy edge of going unstable. When that happens, you don't want to be around. Because this plasma at 100 million degrees smashes into the wall. The plasma moves like a snake inside the vessel. A snake. Have you ever looked, for example, at the Northern Lights? Who were Canadian? Most of us have seen the Northern Lights at one point or another. That is a plasma in a magnetic field, the Earth's magnetic field, and it's being excited by high energy electrons coming from the plasma. If you ever look carefully, you see it shimmering and moving and squiggling. Well, this is an example of plasma instability in the magnetic field. Stellarator, on the other hand, is really boring in comparison. That is, you just turn on the field. The twisty magnetic field that the stellarator has is from these crazy coils. You don't have to drive current inside. And that provides it counters this second order effect that I mentioned. And so there's no current, there's no instability. It's steady state because you're not driving the current by the transformer action. Actually, the current in the tokamak is the root of all evils. And so you have a device that it's really boring. You put the gas in, you heat it up, it ignites, you're off to the races for weeks or months or years. So these are the reasons that the world has always known about the stellarator, in fact. But until the last 10 years or so, we've only been able in the last 10 years, through computer simulation, artificial intelligence, and other methods, demonstrated or define what the magnetic field should look like to be able to confine the particles in the plasma. Now, I would never advocate that we pursue the type of stellarator built. I didn't mention that. That device that you see on the right-hand side is a real stellarator. It's Northern Germany. Now, this device was very difficult to design, very difficult to construct and assemble. And basically, the Germans, it's in Northern Germany, the Germans persevered. They got it right, eventually, at double the cost and double the schedule. But it works. Thank God they did, because they proved that computer optimization of magnetic fields worked. The Americans were developing a very similar stellarator in Princeton, and their budget went from 50 to 100 million to 150 million to like 180 million, and then the Department of Energy chopped it, and they didn't have the patience to the Germans. So it's a bit of a shame. But out of that experience, our friends at Princeton thought about what they could do, and so when they realized the real problem is that this device is really complicated, how can we make it more simple? So actually, I wouldn't advocate the stellarator as they built in Germany. And Princeton came up with the idea of using very simple coils and making this rather complicated three-dimensional plasma by surrounding the plasma with very small magnets. And in fact, there's different ways of making the small magnets, when you add them all together, produce this complicated three-dimensional magnetic field that you need to be able to have this rotational transform to confine the plasma. So, and there's different ways of doing these little magnets. You can just make little permanent magnets. You can buy from Amazon. In fact, I think that's what they may have done. So, in fact, we built a first one a couple of years ago at Princeton. I'll show you that in a minute. And then the coils that are around the outside, they're just simple, planar coils, a lot like a tokamak. So you have a device which looks a bit like a tokamak, but has all the advantages of a stellarator. Okay, so in summary, so what's new in this field? First of all, there are these new results from the stellarator in Germany, demonstrating a predictive understanding of plasma confinement. New computational optimization with the computers nowadays. The computers and the algorithms now are just incredible compared to where we were 10 to 20 years ago. And it's all about optimizing the magnetic field and simulating the plasma. Used to be that to find out how a big device would operate, we'd have to spend $1 billion and take about 5 or 10 years to build the thing to find out. Nowadays, with the modeling that we have, we can, from first principles, calculate what the confinement could be. It's a bit like the old days of the aircraft. Remember when the aircraft started going in the early 1900s? At first, we didn't really understand aerodynamics, the first principle. But we knew how to build an aircraft and how to fly it. But instead, the only way we did that, we built them, and we had simulations and wind tunnels and other things. It was only many years later that we could do the computation of fluid dynamics to actually make first principle calculations. But we're finally at that point in plasma physics. And the reason it's taking so much longer is because this feature, these plasmas allow electric current to flow, and that changes everything. That makes it a lot more complicated. The next thing is the high temperature superconductor. So this is magnetic fusion, and magnets need to be superconducting. Otherwise, you spend all your energy heating up the magnets. So the magnets have to be superconducting. And in the last few years, the high temperature superconductors came out actually more than 3 decades ago. But it's only in the last few years that the Karoshi use has come to the fore. And they are a key part of the advancement of fusion. And okay, so you can operate them at 10 or 20 K as opposed to 4K, which is low temperature superconductor. That's an advantage, yes, of course. But the real big advantage is, it's a bit of a misnomer. The real advantage is that they operate or can operate at a much higher magnetic field. And whenever you make the magnetic field higher, it means you can make the device smaller. Right? And the real problem, one of the big problems with fusion, is the capital cost, which is gigantic, and the time it takes. ITER, for example, is based on physics from 30 years ago and technology from 20 years ago. The problem is, it's taken 20 years to procure it and put it together. And so meanwhile, technology is moving on. So that's exactly what we like to take advantage of in Canada. We take all the lessons from outside of this country and we bring them into this country. So we haven't spent anything, almost, for decades and decades. But everybody spent $100 billion. Okay? We take that knowledge, it's all public domain, and bring it into Canada. That's exactly what we're doing right now. We will, of course, partner with these other. Okay, so why Canada? So, aside from the fact that it's my home and native land, it's the only jurisdiction in the world with a training industry. Okay? Now, this is coming from the Canada. This is something we've had to have for safety reasons. It turns out it's the lifeblood of fusion energy. I'm going to change glasses. So, that's better. The other part, again, from the Canada is that we have a very strong nuclear supply chain. And we just made a decision many decades ago, in the 1950s. Okay? There was a bunch of people sitting around, and we decided in Canada we develop our own nuclear fission program ourselves, okay? With our own expertise. We were fortunate. We had Canadians who were knowledgeable about fission. Some of them participated in the Manhattan Project. After World War II, even before the end of World War II, they could be descended into Ontario. Particularly, they founded Chalk River and Deep River. And we developed our own fission energy program. And thank God they did. I haven't met a single person who thinks the Canada program was a mistake. And this has been the foundation of our energy supply in Ontario, which is the foundation of our economic prosperity. We're at the same decision point, actually, right now when it comes to fusion. The same decision that was faced by those people in the 1950s, we are facing today with respect to fusion. So Ontario, in particular, Canada in general, society with a very high acceptance of nuclear power. There's not many jurisdictions of the world that are as accepting as we are of nuclear power. And it has paid huge, and really benefited our society, the nuclear reactors that we have. And the thing about them is that, okay, the capital cost initially is huge. Indeed, it is true, but a lot of these reactors now are getting mature. And actually, once they get past a certain age, they just print money. Okay? Yes, you have to refurbish them, et cetera, but there's a good reason why they're being refurbished, because they're capable of still making, effectively making a lot of money. We're a strong society with a large industrial, cultural, and educated labor force. Fusion is the highest of high tech, okay? And it's going to take a big lift in terms of education, industry, and resources, and the will to proceed, okay? And that's one of the reasons why Canada is an attractive location, jurisdiction. A high quality of life. Now, this is needed because we don't have the expertise in Canada. We have a lot of the expertise coming from fission, but we don't have everything. And I'll have a slide later on maybe that discuss that a little bit. So we do need to attract some people into this country. It turns out, actually, that they're Canadian. They just happen to be abroad. Okay? They went abroad, they didn't come back. And so there's a small army of Canadians that know about fusion that are just primed, ready to come back, and some of them are on the way. Okay, let's see. Water access for transport. Of course, water is useful for cooling, but also for transport of large components. There's a reason why all the CANDUs are around the Great Lakes. Close proximity is where Queens comes in. Close proximity to world-class universities as sources of both research support, but also young people. We're talking about the creation of a new industry, okay? An industry that will probably rival the automotive industry. If you look at the estimates coming from CNL, this is going to be a big industry. You know why? That's the biggest industry in the world by far. Energy. So Ontario planning to greatly increase our energy supply over the next few decades, and there's a reason for that. And we have a power utility, Ontario Power Generation, which is very forward-looking. They have an official horizon for 60 to 70 years, which is remarkable, really, in this day and age. And so what that means is that they're looking down the road about what electricity they're going to need in half a century from now. And that's one of the reasons why they're building the reactors they're building now, and why they're indeed looking at fusion, because they know very well, on that time scale, fusion will be part of the mix. Several nuclear locations around Ontario. And also one thing that you should realize is that fusion doesn't have the same risk profile as fission. You cannot have a catastrophe. You can put a fusion reactor in an urban center. You can take any of the ugly industrial sites around downtown Toronto or Hamilton and turn them into a fusion reactor with fission. Something you couldn't do with fission. I don't think you'll ever be able to do that with fission. But in fusion you can do it because the risk profile is not a factor of 10 difference, it's factors of 100 or 100,000 difference. So that's very interesting thing. And last, of course, the country is a very good place for R&D tax funding. So in conclusion, Canada is really the best jurisdiction in the world for fusion energy development. But paradoxically, it's in last place among industrialized nations. We've reacted to this, and I'm going to explain what we're doing today. This is easily remedied by bringing some key technologies and building upon the expertise we already have coming from fusion. This brings me to the Center for Fusion Energy. So one thing that's clear is this country needs a coordinating body who help coordinate fusion activities in the country and get things off the ground. There are little pockets of expertise. A lot of it related, all of it related to fission, but actually there's a lot in common between fission and fusion. That's one first thing you must realize. You look at the ITER project, we have 3,500 engineers, 95% come from fission. It's because the two technologies have a lot in common. Yes, okay, fusion uses hot plasma, fission uses the solid uranium, but you go away from that point, and the plants become very, very similar. So this Center for Fusion Energy, you can see the initial partners: Atomic Energy Canada Limited, CNL, OPG, and Stellarex. So what the vision is? Create an ecosystem that enables the development of the fusion technologies and competencies required to prepare Canada for participation in the global fusion energy industry, and that can lead to the creation of domestic fusion energy demonstration devices. So we don't want this country to be in a position that we're buying fusion power plants from other countries. We don't want to be in a position where we're just creating subsystems or exporting our tritium like other raw materials to other countries. We want to add value. We want to create power plants, and these are basically small modular reactors, only they're fusion, created in manufacturing sites in Canada, powering Ontario and other parts of the country, and also exporting to other countries. The creation of a new industry with thousands upon thousands of jobs associated with it. Going in a little bit more detail, so we are developing an ecosystem, an industrial fusion energy ecosystem in Canada to support all of this. The fusion technology we're pursuing is actually in common to all forms of magnetic fusion, not just Stellarex, but also Tokamaks and others. Education is a big part of it. Right? We need a workforce, we need educated young people. For decades upon decades, anybody who was young and wanted to go into fusion had to leave the country. And we want to stop that. And so this is one of the reasons this program is, the CFE program, the Center for Fusion Energy, is particularly focused on enabling the universities. In fact, in the next little while, we're going to announce a fusion device to be located at a university in Ontario. Collaboration, not just among Canadian institutions, but abroad. Okay? You have to face it, a lot of knowledge is abroad, outside of Canada. And the best way to learn is to go and work with people who know more than you. And so we also have a program to second people. We will have a program to second people to other institutions. And these places the doors are wide open. Okay? These institutions are government operated or university operated. They are very welcoming. And like I said, there's a small army of Canadians that did this in the past and are abroad. And we hope we'll do that. But we also, for the moment, we're very happy to send students for internships or whatever to the various institutions that I talked about earlier. There's only one condition. Okay, go back. Commerce, of course, it's all about jobs in the end. And this is something we have to defend our country economically, okay, and secure the security of our energy sources, and also to generate jobs. So that's a big part of it. And lastly, of course, is that we need demonstration devices. The lesson from other countries is that the country has one or two demonstration devices, and everything orbits around the device. Okay, the students, the researchers, the professors, industry, everybody. You need a device to focus the mind. Okay, and this has been demonstrated in many other countries, and was a lesson we learned in Canada in the 1980s, which didn't have such a focusing project. Now, one of the things about fusion is that it's a highly multidisciplinary field. Almost every aspect that's taught at the university has some effect in a fusion energy program. Okay? Again, energy is the biggest industry. Now, I'm not going to go through every line in this table, and if you see, I'm sure you'll find yourself, or a lot of you will find yourselves in different parts of this table. These are basically all aspects that you would find in a fission energy development program, plus others. And those others are shown here. So what I've checked off in green are the expertise that Canada has today because of our CANDU program in related fields, even in aerospace. And what's highlighted in yellow are the areas that we're missing. And these are specific to magnetic fusion. So for example, the system codes for the power plant design, plasma physics. Okay? Plasma physics is almost non-existent in this country. There's a little bit here and there, a little bit out of Queens, a little bit in Toronto, a little bit out west, but not at the level required. And so this is something that we're going to remedy. Universities are being motivated to hire young professors who work in fusion. Okay? For the most part, they're not being hired from Canada, they're coming from abroad. Some of them are Canadian. The high magnetic field, high temperature superconductors. This is a key enabling technology. Doesn't exist in Canada, but not only is it enabling for fusion, it's the creation of a new industry that has applications in many other areas. Transportation, electric aircraft, for example, will probably have to use high temperature superconductors, use levitated trains, medical imaging, many other applications. So this is actually, we're talking about the birth of two industries, fusion and high temperature superconductors. All the electromagnetic analysis, of course, fusion, plasma diagnostics. The other thing is the cryogenic systems. These are cryogenic magnets, and they need to be kept cool down to 10 or 20 Kelvin. So, but you can see if you look at this table, a lot of this exists already in Ontario. It's not a big lift to complete this table. Okay. So far about things. I've been wearing my CFE hat. Okay, talking about fusion and all that. Now, I'm also involved in this private company, Stellarex. Stellarex is a spin-off of Princeton University, U.S. National Lab. Two of the other scientific founders are prominent scientists there, and I was there associated with them one way or another for a long, long time. But the ultimate goal is very aligned with all of this. That is to develop a reliable, safe, cost-competitive, available on-demand fusion energy source as fast as possible. Although we started in the US, we have now based ourselves in Toronto. We have 1 foot in Canada, 1 foot in the US, but basically we're a Canadian company with Canadian investors, and the headquarters is in the Toronto area. So we have a roadmap. There actually, if you follow the fusion scene, there are some private fusion companies who are promising a commercial fusion reactor in 2 or 3 years. That's not going to happen. So we've been at this a long time. We know how to design and deliver. And the reality is, if you want to reduce the risk to the fusion power plant that you ultimately want, you have to go in stages. So where do we stand today? So today, in fact, if you look at this device, I mentioned earlier this device here. So this is a simplified Stellarex. If you look at the coils carefully, they're very simple. This is a real device. It's operating. It follows this simple Princeton approach. It's operating at Princeton Plaza Physics Lab. My chief technology officer was that basically this is his baby. It uses simple magnet that they bought from Amazon. And it's a fusion device. It's a world-leading fusion device. It was built with 3 or 4 graduate students and 3 or 4 engineers in about a year. It is the most optimized accelerator in the world. Okay, now, but that's not good enough. We need to be superconducting. So what you see next, SX alpha, it's not an A, it's meant to be a capital alpha, is a device that is now effectively, I was maybe commissioned. This is a device that the province wants in a University of Ontario tomorrow. So we're moving as quickly as we can. You may have seen a press release at the end of November announcing this Center for Fusion Energy. There's something greater than 50 million allocated. And we'll, as quickly as we can, we'll design and install this. So this would be a substantial, let's call it a gift or donation to a university, and there'll be a call for interest in the very near term, both for the device but also for a funded charity with it. This will be superconducting, and it's a step towards retiring the risk required to get to a reactor. The device that comes after that is also being presently designed. So-called, this in the Stellarex name SX0, but for the rest of the nation, something called the National Fusion Infrastructure Facility. So this is the device that will be a real nuclear device, really producing fusion power, and not fooling around. We put in about 10 megawatts, and we'll get out about 30 megawatts. Q is the ratio of power out divided by power in. So obviously that has to be greater than 1, and we're targeting probably about 3. And we're proposing this at our national lab at CNL Shock River. Beyond that, you have SX1. So this is a first-of-a-kind power plant, a device that would actually put electricity on the grid. You see they keep getting bigger. Of course, it's a normal prototype approach, right? You mimic, you make them smaller, you test it out, and then you guys get confident, you make them bigger. If you look at this development path, it looks a lot like the Candy path. Okay? They were small, they were at Chalk River, and we got them already. We built them. There's not many people here old enough to know what Douglas Point was, but Douglas Point was the first commercial fission reactor, CANDU, in Ontario on the shores of Lake Huron, Douglas Point. SX1 is our Douglas Point for fusion. Just a little close-up, you see this device? It's really not very big, but it has a lot of bang for itself. Superconducting and a non-nuclear device, which is suited for a university. And then I said that it will be announced probably in the next year which university will do it. A little bit more about SX0. So this is, again, the main milestone is Q greater than 1. It will have, one thing I mentioned, just check the time. One thing I mentioned that the neutron that comes out, it goes into materials, it deposits heat, it can activate. So you do have to protect superconducting coils from this neutron, and so this device will have a blanket to basically protect the vacuum vessel and the superconducting coils. One of the things that will achieve, I mean, the thing that will be a bit of a sprint towards this 2 greater than 1 milestone, but after that, this will be also a research device. It will produce neutrons. It can do material studies. You can study plasma physics and other things. So this is very appropriate that this will go to our national lab, which is in the business of doing research in nuclear. Okay. Nuclear includes fission and fusion. And then lastly, the power reactor. Now this device is interesting. This will be ignited, okay? So in the sense, as I told you earlier, if you have enough confinement, you get it up to a certain temperature, the alpha particle starts to self-heat, keep it going. You turn off the external heat, and it just keeps burning by itself. You take away the waste product, which is the helium ash, you add new fuel, and it will just keep on going, just like your a fire. If you keep adding wood to the fire, it will just keep on going. And you don't have to add any more external heat. We'll heat initially with about 20 megawatts of power in the form of microwaves. That's what the ECRH is. It will produce about 600 megawatts of thermal power and electricity, so they say 200, 250 megawatts. That's a lot like the SMRs that they're putting into Darlington, almost identical. In fact, the size and everything about it is very, very similar. We like to make it smaller, but unlike fission, it's difficult to make fusion smaller, unless you take a higher field. We will push the field as high as we possibly can. This will be self-sufficient in the tritium. That is, we start out burning the tritium from OPG, and then it has to make its own tritium. So what happens, I didn't mention this earlier, the neutron comes out, you have to put lithium in the blanket around the wall, and the neutron reacts with the lithium and produces the tritium. You take that tritium, you put it back into the plasma. And this is essential for all types of deuterium, all types of reactors that burn deuterium and tritium, because tritium doesn't impair in nature, and OPG will run out of tritium probably pretty damn quickly. So this advantage to Ontario having the tritium, there's only a window where this advantage exists, maybe for about 20 years. And after that, fusion reactors around the world will produce their own tritium. There's going to be a lot of tritium in the world, huh? And the fact that Canada is the only country in the world with the tritium industry is a huge advantage. Steady state operation, of course, you just turn it on and leave it on. You can dial it up, you can dial it down, but basically it's steady state. Okay, the usual aspects of what you would need for a power station. So my very last slide. So a new energy era is about to arrive. Okay. Energy is the biggest market in the world. This is going to be highly disruptive. We're talking about clean and limited, safe, universally available power, but IP intense. You need to be smart. You need to be educated. That's what the university is doing. As energy, I already mentioned, the biggest market in the world. There's really only a few times in the history of mankind that technological changes of this magnitude have come into pass. So there have been changes in the past that have really dramatically changed the world. This will be an example. Okay? We're going to see one in our lifetime. And there's been a few others in our lifetime, but this will be a biggie, because what's bigger than energy? Fusion, because it is the primary source of energy in the universe, it is the ultimate source of energy. There's nothing that's going to come after this. Okay? You can't think of some fancy type of energy that will come after fusion. No. Once we have fusion, that will be it. All we'll do is keep modifying it, improving it, making it better, making the reactor more efficient, making it smaller, but it will basically be fusion, because there's nothing else after fusion. It's basically an advanced form of nuclear power, but with 90% of the knowledge in common with fission. So don't think fusion versus fission. It's not the case. Okay? Both fusion and fission benefit. Lastly, Canada is re-entering the fusion energy R&D via the Centre for Fusion Energy. The Centre for Fusion Energy is basically a reaction to a mistake that was made in the 1990s. Unfortunately, the world has moved on, and certain people in Ottawa have moved on. And so we're in a situation now to correct a historic mistake, and this is exactly what we're doing. Thank you very much. That's all I have to say. Any questions? And don't be shy. There's no question that's you shouldn't answer.
So we are 2 years going to pass some microphones, so please wait for the information. Please repeat the questions kind of shorter to make sure that they will be exactly around what you're asking.
Thank you very much. I really enjoyed getting to hear you speak about it. What non-scientific factors are like big challenges that stand in the way? For example, competition.
Competition. Well, let's talk about non-factor risk. The biggest risk, actually, is insufficient resources. Insufficient resources, insufficient money. So at the moment, we're fortunate that the private sector has taken notice and they're investing, but it's also pretty clear that the private sector by itself is not going to be able to do this alone. And so if you look at other countries around the world, the ones that are making progress are the ones that have adopted and embraced public-private partnership approach. This is something that's coming naturally in Germany, in Japan, and in the UK. The United States, a little bit, but the United States is the wild, wild west. There's 43 Asian companies. Everybody says they're the best things in sliced bread. The Department of Energy doesn't know who to believe, nor do the investors know who to believe. So the US is a bit, it's confusing. But I would say that's the biggest risk, is the lack of resources. In terms of the tokamak and the Stellarator, they are technically mature enough. Yeah, we have some technological risks, no question about it. You have to do, as usual, risk retirement plan to advance the technical readiness of each subsystem, but it seems very manageable. I mean, we are building an ITER at ITER, something which is much bigger than what we're talking about. Okay, something, these things, what we're talking about SX0 device that we're planning in a few years, this isn't even 5% of what ITER is. So we've done much bigger. The world has done much bigger. But the biggest risk is the resources we do design. But let me add a little bit on that. So I've been around a long time and watched the fusion programs in many different countries. And one thing I've noticed is that when there's an ecosystem and it's broad and broadly supported from all parts of the community, it's very hard for a government to say, no, this isn't something we should do. And every citizen in the country or every stakeholder in the country is saying this is something we should do for the good of the nation. And then things get done.
Thanks for a great talk. I was originally wondering about what happens in the environment of trading, so it was really interesting to hear about these.
I didn't dwell on that. So the real fuel is not deuterium tritium. The real fuel is deuterium, which is everywhere, and the lithium. But also lithium is everywhere. Lithium is dirt cheap, right? And you don't need in a battery. And you don't need to enrich it. You can take just natural lithium. You tend to react. The reaction tends to be with the lithium-6. So if you look at the lithium in the environment, lithium-6 and lithium-7. Lithium-6 is only 6 or 7% of the natural lithium. That's the reaction you want, and even that percentage is very plentiful and sufficient. So you're burning effectively lithium and deuterium. But they're unlimited on Earth for all intents and purposes. We should be so lucky that we should run out of. I don't think mankind may not probably get that. We're talking about hundreds of millions of years from now.
Thank you so much for the talk. I was wondering, you mentioned about the Stellarator in Germany that is tested and working and be able to obviously output power. I was wondering, I know it's kind of an extension of the question that was asked earlier, but what's the main technical aspect that's holding it back? Is it the complexity that you mentioned about that sort of Stellarator?
You're talking about that particular Stellarator?
Yeah, like what was preventing that from being used?
The first thing, they're not actually making power. The Germans are terrified of things nuclear, as you know. They shut down perfectly good fission reactors some years ago. And the chancellor was a nuclear physicist herself. Nobody understands. Anyways, so that device, they're only allowed to use hydrogen. And so there's no significant reaction between hydrogen and hydrogen. And so they don't really make fusion power. So what they do is they heat this plasma at a very high temperature, and they've demonstrated they can get to a very high temperature, but there's no nuclear fusion reactions going on because they're not using deuterium and tritium, or even deuterium and deuterium. Now, the reality is those coils are damn hard to make. Okay? Princeton failed, or at least the Department of Energy. counts of them. And in fact, if you look, there's other fusion endeavors in Germany where they're just going to take that stellarator and they're going to scale it up. And they're planning to use high temperature superconductors. I think they're going to have problems. We know they're going to have problems. We don't advocate that approach. And they did it. They got Stellarator in Germany. Eventually it worked. It was double the budget, double the schedule. We got it working. Okay? So it's possible that they may succeed in that way. But there's another problem that I didn't really talk about, rather than going back to the slide. If you look carefully at that, all those coils are very close together. Maybe I'll go back and show you. This is an important point, actually. Sorry. Here. Yeah. On the right-hand side, that's the Stellarator in northern Germany. Look how close the coils are together. Right? Now, one of the realities about fusion, you have a thermonuclear plasma, 100 million degrees, facing a wall, which is at 200 or 300 degrees Celsius. You can imagine there's going to be a problem. Right? What happens is, slowly but surely, you destroy the wall. And it's a question of how fast. Okay? So we have plans that the reactor wall should last about 10 years. The reality is, if you're not careful, it may only last like a year. It takes you a year to replace it, and you have to do it robotically. So what good is a reactor that doesn't operate? Only operates half the time. But you have to get inside. Now, how are you going to get inside this device? Look at the coils, how close they are together. Okay? So you're never going to be able to get inside this device. But this reactor, this device was not a nuclear device, and they weren't planning on going inside and fixing it. Now, this is where Princeton's idea comes in. If you look at this device, look how far apart the coils are. So you have basically, not shown on here, but these coils are a long ways apart, and you have ports big enough to send initially people when you're assembling it, later when you're operating robotic systems in to replace the wall that needs to be changed every few years, hopefully every 10 years. So this is a very important point. You take away those magnets on the outside, the little magnets, and then you have direct access inside. So the answer is, we don't believe that the reactor that we're doing, the device, this thing down here, is the way to go in the future. It's difficult to construct, and it doesn't allow maintenance. Actually, the point that we should have pointed out that way.
Thank you. So if I can ask one more quick question. Sure. Do you think that along with the simplified Stellarator design that there'll have to be more advanced materials used for the reactor wall?
For sure. So what we know, every technology ends up being a materials problem, right? Eventually. And so fusion, that's rather extreme. You have a wall which is being bombarded with energetic neutrons, energetic ions. It's going to get, and very high heat fluxes. The heat flux on these walls in some locations, it's like, the tiles on the space shuttle as coming back through the atmosphere. That's what it's like. So heat flux is comparable to the surface of the sun. So very, very high heat fluxes bombarding the wall, and the wall will wear out. So that's a serious materials problem. And you have to have a material that's resistant to the neutrons. So there's no end to research possible. Today I toured the nuclear materials research facility out near the 401. I don't know if any of you know about it or seen it. Very impressive, actually. I had no idea that such a thing existed. It does fission research, but it's more or less the same type of research for fusion. So materials research, for every industry, you go on dealing with materials forever. It's always about making the material better, cheaper, lighter, whatever. This will go on forever.
I have one question, so the theory but for this one there.
Thank you for the talk. I was wondering, how can we stay educated for the nuclear industry, and especially is there specific opportunities like conferences or competitions that you would suggest someone who wants to break into the nuclear industry to gain more experience?
So, when you say the nuclear industry, you mean in general? Do you mean fusion or fission or both? What do you mean?
Anything, especially something specific in Canada like this.
Okay. Well, it depends what stage you are in life, I think. If you're young in university, okay, so engineering or physics, if you want to be technical. But listen, there's a lot of other aspects of that. I don't know if you're technical or non-technical, but even if you're non-technical, there's a lot of aspects of fusion. There's energy policy, which is very important and enabling for any fusion energy program. There's organizational aspects. There's fundraising, which is a huge, huge deal. And I'm telling you, it's a real pain when you're a technical person and you have to fundraise. I've learned this firsthand. Listen, it's a very heavy lift. The energy program of Canada, Ontario. This is recognized. You see the province of Ontario advertising all the time about energy. There's a reason. It's fundamental to the economic welfare of our province. And we have to be thinking ahead. Because it takes a long time to develop energy sources. It's not something you can say, oh, yeah, next year we need more power. You have to think decades in advance. And so energy policy and anything associated with the organization of energy. And now, if you've already graduated, you have your engineering degree or your physics degree, there's and so, like I said, you look at either 3,500 people, only about 30 of us, 40 of us actually have years of fusion experience. Everybody else is coming from, the engineering companies, the Hatches of the world, and the Jacobs of the world, and Atkins Realises of the world. They are not in fusion, they're not in fusion, maybe not even in fission, but they're mechanical engineers, or similar expertise they can contribute. So what we need is a project to get off the ground, and they're just starting. By the way, there's also activities going on in Truckers, and they are always looking for people. There's also a fusion company that's been created, spun out of CNL, called Fusion Fuel Cycle. They're focused on the tritium aspect of the problem. You may have heard of a fusion company out in Vancouver called General Fusion. They're a moderate-sized company, and they're doing some interesting things. And there'll be more activities coming. Stellarex is planned to be based in Southern Ontario, and we'll have some projects that are starting now, in fact, SX Alpha that I showed you earlier, and we're already designing SX0. So ultimately, there'll be lots of opportunities coming up in the next few years. And so if you want to get education, then I would, if you want to do graduate studies, then there's opportunities also in Ontario, but also abroad. And so if you're interested in doing graduate studies abroad, I can recommend places to go. You just want condition, you have to come out.
So, the questions that they will go, I think there's one question there, and then we will the person which makes the microphone. Maybe it's not.
I'm not sure if I missed this, but how are we actually going to get the energy from this? I'm not sure if it's going to drive a steam cycle or anything. How's the energy transfer actually going to happen from the accelerator to being actually useful?
So, so what happens is the fusion reactions occur in the core. So so the fusion reactions are occurring. The fusion reactions are occurring in the center, okay, the hot gas. This is in the gas phase, okay? So this power, remember the fusion reaction creates an alpha particle, which is trapped in the magnetic field in a neutron. Neutron comes flying out. It takes about a meter to completely stop the neutrons. And so that power, most of the energy is the neutrons, and that power is being dissipated in this material which is stopping the neutrons. I would say most of the power actually stops in the first 10 or 15 centimeters of material. That material has to be water cooled or cooled. Okay, so in the simple-minded idea, that's water cooled. It's at 500 degrees or 400 degrees, and that carries the heat. That's the primary loop. It takes that heat out. You generate steam in a secondary loop. You run it through a turbine. You make electricity. Think of a fission reactor, like a Kennedy reactor, or even a coal station. You have to make steam, drive turbines, to make electricity. But initially, it's starting as a hot gas. This is different than fission. You don't have a hot gas like that. Does that explain? Do you understand?
Oh yeah, I just wasn't sure if it's going to be another steam cycle, so driving it again.
Fairly can't hear you.
Steam cycles drive most of the energy sources in the world. So I wasn't sure if it's going to through maybe radiation or some other sort of way than like just heating up water. Like, I don't know if that makes sense.
I don't understand.
I just didn't know if it was going to be another like heating up water again, or like just a sort of like different form of energy transfer. I just
Well, rather than water?
Yeah.
Oh, yeah, so there's other ideas of using other coolant other than water. If that's what you mean. I'm just giving water as a simple example. So there's other types of heat transfer medium that you can use. Liquid metals, other types of heat transfer you can use. And they have pros and cons, different situations you would use other materials. The advantage of other materials is potentially the coolant would be at low pressure. You use hot water, the high pressure could be very hot. And so there are pros and cons of using water. The good thing about water is it's a proven technology that's been used for 100 years, or more, in coal power stations.
We've got only one last question here.
Thank you for being out here tonight. But I have a question about will topicals and stellarators ever become small enough to be feasible to build a few of them around different cities rather than one big one to power?
Yeah,
Like the same amount of like power out of them?
yeah, it's a good question. Again, I mentioned this. The fission, unfortunately, one unfortunate thing about fusion is it scales with size. You can't make them team. You're not going to have, you've seen this movie Back to the Future. He opens up his DeLorean, there's Mr. Fusion in there, he throws in a banana peel, he gets more energy. The older people here. Unfortunately, that's the long ways off from fusion because they scale with size. Okay? And the way we can make them smaller is make that field higher, magnetic field higher. This is where the high temperature superconductors come in because we can operate them in a higher field. In fact, actually, the superconductor that we have our sights on, we don't know the limit. We don't know how high we can go. All the indications, it doesn't show any limits. The real problem is that there's no way of making fields that high because the magnetic forces of the coil are so large that the coil breaks itself, it explodes basically. They look at the magnetic energy density. It's a little magnetic ball. The energy storage in the magnetic field is huge. And so that becomes then a strength of materials issue. How do you hold the magnet together to make the device smaller? But we're getting more clever all the time. That will be the ultimate issue, is the strength of the materials with respect to the magnet. The other aspect of it is that as long as it's deuterium and tritium and you're producing neutrons, you need about a meter of material to shield superconductors from the neutrons. Because you don't want the neutrons to get to the superconductor. You need somewhere like half a meter to a meter of material to stop those neutrons. And of course, in the end, there's no point making the plasma this big if the blanket is going to be this big, and the thing that goes around the outside of it this big. So you're always going to look at a device which is sort of the size of SX0, the thing that I showed you there. It's probably going to be difficult to get much lower than that, as long as you're doing deuterium and tritium, where you have a neutron. So the wonderful thing about fusion is you have a lot of options, and we're just at the start, actually. I suspect that for the next 1,000 years, we will continue to optimize stellarators to get them better and better superconductors, better materials. We have to start somewhere. And then once we get to that point, then economic necessity will drive us to make it better and better and better. But like I said, fusion is the ultimate energy choice. I should mention one thing, that we're pursuing deuterium and tritium because it's easiest. At a given temperature, it has the highest reaction rate. There are other fusion reactions, which are also could be attractive. In fact, there's a reaction just between deuterium and deuterium. It's more difficult, but now you're using just deuterium. Like, it's everywhere. It's in your body. It's everywhere. You don't even have to breathe the tritium. You don't need the tritium at all. And so I believe that will come shortly after we have DT. But again, that requires either higher magnetic field or a bigger device. Now remember that electricity becomes cheaper the bigger the reactor. If you look at the studies for the SMRs going into Darlington or brand new big good Canada, the electricity from a big Canada is cheaper than coming from a little SMR. A lot of overhead associated with a small device, but they're big or small, it's the same overhead. In some cases. So in the end, I suspect that we will, you have a utility like OPG, they're not scared, they're not afraid of a large device. And so I think the large devices will still be around for a while. It's the most economic way of producing power for a big population, for a big city. Now, it's different. You have this community on the Arctic Ocean, in the middle of nowhere, right? Now you want to think about making a small device so that you can power a small community. That's a different thing. There you don't care if it's going to cost more per kilowatt hour.
Thank you.
I believe that we need to start our Q&A session. Before thanking everyone, they will your announcement. So we need to start today, not tomorrow. Actually, the teacher will be delivering a colloquium to the physics department. If anyone is interested and hasn't already received an email, just give me now and I can forward to you. So you have all the information.
That talk will be a little bit more scientific, a little more technical.
Yes, but I can give you after the questions. Okay, so let's thank the volunteers, everyone the answer from the
Let me just
video.
say one thing. So first of all, it's been a real pleasure presenting to you. Okay, so this is my first professional visit to Queen's University. I've spent the last 42 years abroad. On the other hand, I feel like I've gone to Queen's because I've had 3 children go to Queen's. And I've been here many times, moving from apartment to house to so, but it was a pleasure to be here in a professional sense for the first time in my career. And it's good to see you all, and thank you for listening to me.